So, all right. So today we're going to be focusing on Lacan's unacknowledged, at least that's the hypothesis, unacknowledged reception of Hegelian notions of property. And we're really privileged to have with us Professor Björn Quiring, who joins us from the School of English at Trinity College Dublin, at the University of Dublin. And as I mentioned, he's an invited professor here at the EHESS this year. His research is really at the intersection of literary theory and legal theory and philosophy. And he works primarily on the works of Walter Benjamin, Hans Blumenberg, Gilles Deleuze, William Epson, and Lacan, and Hegel. Now, his first book was called Shakespeare's Curse, The Aporias of Ritual Exclusion in Early Modern Royal Drama, which focused on the uses of the ritual curse in Shakespeare's history plays. His second book was titled Trials of Nature, The Infinite Law Court of Milton's Paradise Lost, and that book investigated Milton's refashioning of the metaphor of the identification of nature with an all-encompassing court of law and the associated process of judgment. His present research and his present work focuses on the dialectics of phantasmatic property in English literature, and that is what ties directly to this presentation today. The title of the presentation is Subjectivity and Phantasmatic Property, Unacknowledged Hegelianisms in Lacan's Theory of Object Relations. I see. It was there. That's why it was giving me a hard time. Okay, right. Okay, so I think we can, well, let me just start. I mean, it's going anyway, but let me just hit that so that we don't go out. And let me get rid of it for now. And then let me turn the parole to Professor Quiring.
Merci. Hello. Thanks for the invitation and for the kind introduction. Pleasure to be here. Please excuse that I give the presentation in English, but my French has become rusty. I've studied in Paris many moons ago, and now French. I can still read French, but speaking is a little bit slow. So what I will try to do is to delineate the theoretical aspects of my current research project on phantasmatic properties, as Ben already said, and how it is related to Hegel and his reception history, mostly the Lacanian reception history. So what I find interesting is that Hegel sketches how property can be thought of as a constitutive of subjectivity. To use Lacanian terminology, how it contributes to the constitution of the symbolic order. Can you hear me all right? Can you understand me all right, by the way? Okay. So property is a term that frequently pops up both in philosophy and in psychoanalysis, but it's seldom really developed as a concept, right? As far as I can see, at least, beyond the specificity of the capitalist relation, right? Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus speak of a having more profound than being, but they leave that idea rather vague, beside pointing to some assorted remarks by Gabriel Tarde, to whom we will return. And in psychoanalysis, it's a commonplace that a man is male insofar as he has the phallus, right? But even though no one can really have the phallus, I mean, that's one of Lacan's punchlines. So what that having actually implies remains rather nebulous, right? We have extensive theories of possession and ownership in jurisprudence. but the question is whether they really do justice to the problem. Relatively dominant is the notion of Hans Kelsen, that property is ultimately an intersubjective relation. The power of persons to restrict other persons from the use of certain objects, right? And from that point of view, property is a social relation between human beings regarding things, rather than something that defines the relation between human beings and things in general. And there are reasons to have some doubts about this conception. Jean Schroeder, who has gone furthest in the direction of Lacanian theory of property, criticizes it in her article Schicks, Nicks, Bundle of Sticks. And she points out that even if we describe property as a relationship among subjects, it's a relationship mediated through objects. So the central question here would be that of the status of property in the, let's say, in the social unconscious. Despite its apparent legal precision, there's something suggestively vague about the term property. As Alain Potage pointed out, there's an ownership spectrum that ranges from very strong claims of absolute control to rather weak claims of restricted use. Some kind of bodily, palpable occupation seems to be involved. In Justinian's Digest, possessio is derived from the position of standing on something and thus occupying it, right? Quia naturalita tenetur ab eo qui ei insistit. But obviously, there are also more indirect, symbolic, and even rhetorical and poetical aspects of property. At the heart of each appropriation is a claim that must somehow be communicated and accepted as valid by someone. And what claims will be accepted is ultimately a social question, and as such, it's constantly transforming. There's an intricate web of rights and laws and conflicts and conventions in constant flux that keeps redefining property all the time. Perhaps Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, captures this elusive status of property best when he defines it as nothing but the basis of expectation. And recently there have been some interesting critical studies of property, and one I found particularly inspiring is that of Eva von Redeker concerning phantom possession. What she means by that term are basically ownership claims to own things that the claimant does not actually legally own, but raises claims on anyway. Redeker develops the concept of phantom possession, investigating the function of racism and sexism in the modern political economy. She points out that white workers in the 19th century, while owning almost nothing, and therefore not participating in the privileges of the propertied classes, had at least the compensatory privilege of embedded legal claims on blacks and women. Redeker's point is that even after the abolition of slavery and the legal emancipation of women, these former legal property claims persist in the form of private norms and demands, constantly feeding on what she calls the fantasy of an object of control haunting its vacated domain. And these claims can articulate themselves in very different ways, from subtle attempts of verbal domination to the denunciation of people who do not stay in their proper place, to actual violence, right? With murder demonstrating most forcefully the capacity of the phantom owners to dispose freely of their phantasmatic property. And I find this inspiring, partly because I find it unsatisfying. In everyday life, there's often no hard and fast border between legitimate and illegitimate claims, right? We tend to navigate considerable gray zones and just act on vague expectations based on experiences that certain acts are permissible in certain situations and that others will be sanctioned. All the more since most of us don't have studied the law books, right? And under these auspices, the distinction between real property and phantom property appears rather vague and based on an ultimately ethical distinction between good and bad property claims. In that context, the question arises, what property is not phantom property, that is ultimately phantasmatic? For example, from Bartolus to William Blackstone, famous jurists and beyond, ownership has been defined as absolute, unlimited discretionary power over a thing of the outside world. But this power meets rather banal physical limits, right? I can't turn my lead into gold, and I'm even unable to stop the milk in my fridge from turning sour. And since diverse notions of right and property tend to be at work in a society and between societies, some claims are bound to encounter counterclaims, so that only the result of physical and verbal altercations will tell which have expired and which have not. So property relations might be defined as an unstable, shared phantasm that assigns functions not only to the objects in question, but also to their owners. Their properties go hand in hand with certain social obligations, usually, and expectations, including the obligation to occasionally destroy the property. What most investigated as potlatch, but even the banker lighting a cigarette with a $100 bill acts according to certain social conventions. Lacan's concept of phantasm may be useful here because he emphasizes that reality and phantasm mutually presuppose and generate one another, so that one cannot oppose the phantasm to reality, where you would arrive once you have seen through and traversed the phantasm. Because that's precisely how many critical discourses approach the notion of property, in sort of moralistic attempts to separate good, legitimate, and bad, illegitimate appropriations. The problem with this approach is the underlying classical assumption that there's a kind of underlying pre-established harmony, kind of natural distribution of properties that would allocate to each pre-existent person that which is proper to her or him. And that would more or less automatically establish itself at certain distortions, first and foremost in present discourse, the demands of capitalism would be eliminated. So, and you might also say that an unquestioned Lockean heritage in Marxism might be at least partly responsible for this idealization, but that would be a topic for another presentation. So this is just a background sketch to clarify why tracing a line between Hegel and Lacan might be helpful in this context, because they insist that there needs to be some form of property for a subject to emerge in the first place. We find the relevant passages in the Elements of the Philosophy of Right, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, in the chapter on law testing reason, we already find some ideas on the necessity of property that prefigure passages of the elements, but the relation between property and personhood remains undeveloped there. One might argue that the phenomenology of spirit presents the progress of spirit as a process of spiritual appropriation, and is therefore a kind of exemplification of the topic of phantasmatic property, but that's also another topic for another day. So let's return to the elements. What's worth emphasizing is that the elements of the philosophy of right really start out with property. It's the topic of the first chapter of the first part of the book. The order of the chapters is not chronological, but a logical one. But still, Hegel thus posits property claims as the foundation of the juridical order, of the social order. It's the first move beyond mere existence. And the central point that Hegel makes in this context is that he says the person must give himself an external sphere of freedom in order to have being as idea. This has been designated as the central doctrine of the Hegelian doctrine of property. Property is first and foremost the sphere in which one can exercise one's own free will. And this free will has no independent existence apart from this exercise. Property is the determinate existence, the Dasein of freedom, and thus not only the means to an end, but essential as an end in itself. The self forms by becoming aware of itself, and this process unfolds in its interaction with its property, that is, in the imposition of its free will on objects in the outside world. And that is why Hegel can say, not until he has property does the person exist as reason. It's to be noted that he uses the term person here. That's also used in jurisprudence to designate any entity that is able to own property or enter into contracts or sue and be sued and so on. But he extends the term beyond its strictly legal applicability. For example, when he states that property is the condition of self-reflexivity, that in property the person is linked up with itself. Nota bene, in property, the person only enters into a relation with itself, not with other persons at this point. Contra Kelsen. It is through property that the will of the personality manifests and thus becomes recognizable for others, as well as for itself. Subsequently, this free will can be related to another will, and this enables the form of contract to be introduced and thus establish links between persons. Property thus appears not as the result, but as the condition of social interaction, right? And Hegel affirms that property is important not only as a means to a higher purpose, but as an end in itself. In this context, he gives a philosophical twist to the separation between possession and ownership that goes back to Roman law. While possessing is just the abstract external state of having something at one's disposal to fulfill one's needs, owning a thing is an essential purpose in itself, insofar as it is valued as a manifestation, as the first Dasein of personal freedom. It's not bound to any particular need and therefore not any particular object, and is experienced as more important than these objects. In Lacanian terms, property is here represented as the object of human desire rather than of biological need. Property only secondarily fills a need. On a basic level, it provides a person with a position and orientation in the world. Even though freedom is independent of concrete forms, it's not something abstract. It must be experienced in a concrete situation, first and foremost as the right to engage as you like with unfree things and to impose your will on them. Hegel distinguishes three modes of this imposition, also sort of mirror legal conceptions, namely appropriations, use, and disposal. In a way, possession always includes the destruction, the disposal of the appropriated thing. Even if it's not literally destroyed, it's negated, subsumed to the will of the owner. There are many different ways to enact this subsumption, but in all variants, the appropriated thing doesn't remain what it was. The owner gives it a new form, marks it in some way, making it the bearer of a sign that communicates the owner's will. According to Hegel, this appropriation can also happen by an act of mere designation. Hegel writes, physical seizure can occur only in the case of an individual thing, whereas the designation of ownership means taking possession in terms of representational thoughts. Because of this pivotal role of representations, of signs, the process in which the person acquires property necessarily starts to run in parallel and interdependence with the process in which the same person acquires language. And when property becomes a matter of representation, it's logical that intangibles as well as tangibles can be owned, because they both can be represented. And this gives Hegel the opportunity to talk about intellectual property, copyright basically. But one could also include other representable things like affections or character traits. Everything representable is ownable and therefore is up for grabs. And here intersubjectivity comes in again as a struggle for the recognition of ownership claims. For the consolidation of subjectivity, one's personhood has to be recognized by another person, and this subjectivity only exists in the subject's claim to tangible and intangible properties, since they are its only individuating characteristics. So the individuation of a subject depends on processes of appropriation that turn out to be processes of self-appropriation in a way and depend on intersubjective recognition of property claims. And things can go awry, obviously, in these processes. It's necessary for the argument that the thing that I appropriate only becomes rightfully mine if it has no freedom in itself, no sphere of interiority that surpasses the exterior law of cause and effect. And a human being has interiority, unlike animals, according to Hegel. So a human being has a sphere of freedom and therefore cannot really be owned. But nonetheless, slavery exists as a symptom of a failure of the process of human self-recognition and self-liberation through acquisition. And this leads Hegel to the somewhat baffling statement that he says, the wrong of slavery is the fault not only of those who enslave or subjugate people, but of the slaves and the subjugated themselves. Apparently the slaves should have insisted on their freedom at the point of their enslavement, and thus should have died for it. And while Hegel assigns to slaves an absolute right to free themselves, he basically represents them as a kind of failed subjects, who abase themselves by their unwillingness to give their life for the freedom that defines their humanity. Thus, the very impossibility of owning a person becomes a legitimation, paradoxically, of slavery in Hegel. On the other hand, if things go well, the mutual recognition of intentions takes the form of their coordination by agreements and exchanges among subjects, namely contracts. And on that basis, larger social units are formed among which some kind of solidarity prevails, first and foremost the family and the state. And the decisive manifestation of that solidarity and interest in a common good is common property, that we also have in Hegel, although it comes later in the book, so it's often overlooked. So the family as a convergence of interests can thus be described as a universal and enduring person. That's quite a striking claim. And Hegel says the family as a person has its external reality in property, and only in the latter, in the shape of resources, does its substantial personality have its existence. Again, this is a strong statement, isn't it? The personal continuity of a family across the generations is in its property and nothing else, such as common blood or whatever. The notion that the institution of the state also relies on some form of common property is not developed as extensively, but Hegel also mentions it in passing as a necessary supplement of private property. Now, all this differs from the theory of property that I think has had most influence on the current discourse on the topic, in everyday life, namely that of John Locke. Locke legitimates individual property largely through its association with individual work. A priori, in Locke, every man has property in his own labor, and if he mingles his labor power with an object, for example, a piece of land or a block of wood, to produce grain or a table, he has the right to claim the products of his work as his property. By contrast, Hegel largely focuses on appropriation as an act of seizing and imposing one's will on something, often using a vaguely military vocabulary of conquest. And while Hegel describes a simultaneous genesis of property and personhood, In Locke, there's no genesis, because the human being is from the God-given beginning defined as proprietor, since he's always equipped at least with the ownership of his own labor power. But Locke and Hegel also agree on many points. In both their theories, property is identified as the essence of personhood, in a way, so that a subject must recognize its identity in the actual process of appropriation and acquisition. So property defines the individual as individual, not least by assigning it a specific mode of rationality. In this context, it's worthwhile considering a link between Locke's two treatises of government and his essay on human understanding. Namely that Locke in the essay occasionally describes the cognitive process by which a person constitutes itself out of a melange of sense impressions and memories as a process of appropriation. The freedom of each individual is attained by that individual's submission to the demands of property acquisition. And with Etienne Balibar, it is worth asking whether under these circumstances it is not property that is truly free, and not the person. So the property rather than the owner, who is basically subjugated to a process of appropriation that defines him and the range of his possible actions. In other words, is the essence of the Lockean and Hegelian subjectivity ultimately to be identified as property, so that the subject is basically reduced to the role of an agent of what Balibar calls a transcendental power of appropriation. Now, this question is hard to answer because the subject appears twice in this process. You might say as the, with Lacan you might say, and Bonviniste you might say, as the sujet d'énonciation and the sujet d'énoncé. Perhaps it's best to approach the problem from the angle of self-ownership. Locke defines personhood by a naturally given property in oneself, while for Hegel, self-ownership is not naturally given but acquired. And in this context, he differentiates between interiority and exteriority. Insofar as a person is an object of the senses, it is external to itself. But it is also a free will that is not bound by the chain of cause and effect and thus beyond the world of the senses. As will, I'm not identical with my body, and this non-identity with my body is the condition of my freedom. One's non-identity with the body is conceived as a potential ownership of the body in Hegel. I have my body insofar as I can take possession of it and dispose of it. Hegel writes, I have these limbs and my life only insofar as I so will it. The animal cannot mutilate or destroy itself, but the human being can. At the same time, Hegel emphasizes that a person has the duty not to dispose of himself, not to mutilate or kill himself, precisely because the living body he owns is not altogether external to him. At this point, it becomes obvious that something doesn't turn round here. Having and being can't be made to coincide, either by subsuming having to being or vice versa. I, as a subject, cannot be altogether identical with what I own. You can also see that in the banal case of incorporation. People say that one can't have the cake and eat it too, which implies that once I've eaten the cake, I no longer have it, because it has become me in a way, in such a manner that I can no longer dispose of it. The cake passes a threshold, strange gray area between being and having, from which the two emerge and come to diverge. And that is often associated with the area between one's inside and one's outside. So there's this uncanny line or point of indistinction where being and having, like personhood and property, morph into one another. And at this point, that remains, I would say, an unresolved problem in Hegel, which he sort of fences off with ethical demands, Lacan comes in via Donald Winnicott. Because Winnicott, as an analyst, also engages with this gray zone where the notion of ownership forms along with the notion of personhood. So in his article, Transitional Objects and Transitional Phenomena from 1951, he engages with the border between inside and outside, which he somewhat rashly identifies with the border between the subjective and the objective. I have found no sign that Winnicott ever read Hegel, but his clinical observations are relevant to the issue. He observes children's relation to the first object they recognize as possession, which is also the first object they recognize tout court, according to him. And he labels this object the transitional object. He starts with what he calls the very rich patterns ordinarily displayed by babies of both sexes in their use of certain objects in their vicinity, starting when they're around 6 months old. So while sucking their thumb or knuckles, they start to fondle a sheet or blanket or doll or a teddy, or put these objects into their mouths too. Usually the baby tends to concentrate on one specific object that serves to ward off anxiety and that the baby, in Winnicott's words, becomes addicted to. To some degree, it's an extension of the child beyond her or his own body. To some degree, it also stands in for the maternal breast, but Winnicott emphasizes that this is not decisive, because it's just as important that the transitional object is not the breast, and that the infant is well aware of that the object merely stands in for the breast. And this is connected to Winnicott's general theory about mothering. In the ideal scenario in which the mother is what he calls a good enough mother, she adapts quite thoroughly to the infant's needs at the beginning, so that the infant can get the impression that the outside world is under its control, that it does not collide with the infant's wishes. When all is said and done, that there is no strict separation between the hallucinatory omnipotence of the child and whatever the outside world supplies it with. So the breast, or alternatively a bottle that feeds the child, is therefore experienced as a part of the infant's body. And that also means that the giving of the breast is not interpreted by the child as a social act, of interchange that involves persons. To put it in Deleuze-Guattarian terms, what the child experiences at that point is a machinic assemblage of breast and mouth. And then gradually the mother starts to let the child experience small frustrations that undermine his illusions without altogether shattering them in a traumatic fashion. Thus a small gap opens between wish and fulfillment. And through this gap, the transitional object, the first possession, comes in. And this possession usually has properties like warmth and some suggestions of vitality. And this object fills this gap, but at the same time also comes to stand in for the gap and stabilize the gap. Winnicott writes that incomplete adaptation to need makes objects real, that is to say, hated as well as loved. With the help of this first possession, the infant can negotiate its hallucinatory control of the outside world, gradually letting go the illusion of omnipotence and replacing it by muscular manipulation, exercising control over the object by grasping it and letting it go again. And this manipulation, Winnicott states, is not yet reality testing. It's not yet interacting with the world in the strict sense. The transitional object is not yet experienced as completely distinct from the infant. But these manipulations are the condition for subsequent engagements with reality. Winnicott uses juridical, almost Hegelian language here, stating that the infant assumes rights over the object. And he expresses this assumption in the traditional way of taking possession by grasping and letting go. It seems significant in this context that the digest of Justinian in the passage I already mentioned connects the appropriation by way of physical occupation with the Greek term katoche that shares its root with the psychoanalytical term kathexis, which designates libidinal investment. By the way, the original term Freud used and that James Strachey translated as kathexis is Besetzung, which translates as occupation. So the infant can only endure its abrogation of oceanic omnipotence if it obtains as a kind of, compensation this physical, vaguely erotic possession over the first thing that it acknowledges as independent of itself, namely the transitional object. So this object marks the gray area from which the flexible border between the infant and what is not the infant emerges. In other words, possession forms as the zone in which the difference between internal qua subjective and external qua objective is negotiated. The first differentiation in property is not that between mine and not mine, but that between me and mine as the first not me, the first acknowledged outside object. And only on the basis of its engagement with the transitional object, the child becomes capable of distinguishing objects and people as entities that are outside, separate from its own self. The transitional object that is both part of the infant and separate from it is the matrix of all its future object relations, in the broad sense given to that term of psychoanalysis. So in psychoanalysis, all relations to the object of your loves and hates, persons, parents, wives, and so on. They are all object relations. Of course, the infant did relate to outside things before it invested in the transitional object, but they were either experienced as connections within the context of machinic assemblages, such as the connection between mouth and breast, or as traumatic. Now, insofar as the transitional object stands for both the presence and the absence of these connections, it mediates between the two. It's a present absence. That is a symbol. Winnicott states that when we witness an infant's employment of the first not me possession, we are witnessing both the child's first use of a symbol and the first experience of play. Now, an obvious predecessor of this idea of the symbolic game is the Fort-Da game that Freud described in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which his grandson, in order to come to terms with the absences of his mother, kept throwing a wooden reel attached to a piece of string over the edge of his crib, uttering the syllable O, and then pulling it in again and uttering the syllable A or Da, thus performing a representation of the comings and goings of his mother as a process that he had under control, thus working toward the acknowledgement of the mother's persistent absences. Lacan pointed out that the boys accompanying O and A sounds form the simplest possible differential symbolic order of just two signifiers, a germ cell of language use. En passant, Winnicott mentions that certain sound patterns and more or less nonsensical words that the child likes to use can also function as transitional objects. Here we observe again the parallel development of the order of possessions and the order of language. In this context, it's relevant that the rights that the infant assumes over the transitional object include not only the privilege of to lovingly fondle and cuddle it, but also the what's called in legal terms the jus abutendi, the right to abuse it and to treat it aggressively. So the gray zone between inside and outside offers the opportunity for a wide spectrum of interactions. Winnicott claims that it constitutes the greatest part of the infant's experience. And that part is bound to become larger as the infant grows, since it is by way of the transitional object and the child's investments into it that its outside world is endowed with meaning. The transitional object loses its own meaning, not because its illusory investments are replaced with real ones, but because, in the words of Winnicott, the transitional phenomena have become diffused, have become spread out over the whole intermediate territory between inner psychic reality and the external world as perceived by two persons in common. That is to say, over the whole cultural field. The uncertain zone between subjective inside and objective outside is extended, not abolished, into the fields of interpersonal relationships, the arts and religions, as well as diverse forms of social and sexual deviance. Transitional objects are transitional not in the sense that they lead from illusion to reality, but that they open the field where the negotiation between them can take place that is characteristic of human experience. And the transitional field remains the field of property relations. One might suppose that the communal use of symbols also enables forms of communal property, but that remains undeveloped in Winnicott as far as I can see. The psychoanalyst Matthias Hirsch has written an article on another question that Winnicott largely skips over, namely whether the infant's own body can itself come to function as a transitional object. So we touch upon the Hegelian problem of self-possession here. Hirsch states that one's own body also can become a transitional object, but that this is generally a pathological development. Basically, it occurs when the subject, experiencing traumatic assaults from the outside world of whatever nature, feels sufficiently threatened to split off the impressions of the outside body from the rest of psychic life, thus making the border between outside and inside seemingly stronger, although obviously not completely impermeable and unassailable. Self-possession would thus be a symptom of alienation, an inappropriate objectification of the subject. The problem with this is that it supposes that that the subject pre-exists and transcends the transitional object, and that is precisely the question, right? Hegel makes personal subjectivity dependent on the appropriating experience of an object. And Winnicott goes into the same direction, but seems more vague in some of his formulation of what this implies. And that is where Lacan comes in, whose objet can be understood as a hegelianization of Winnicott's transitional object. Lacan himself pointed out that his conception of objet was decisively influenced by Winnicott's transitional object. Given Lacan's general aversion against the Anglo-American branches of psychoanalysis, it's surprising how positively Lacan keeps referring to Winnicott, and Winnicott in turn to Lacan, by the way, at least to his theory of the mirror stage. Unfortunately, Lacan, as far as I can see, never really worked out the relation between the emergence of the transitional object and the mirror stage. In the fourth seminar, he states that he will leave aside the question whether the notion of the not me first emerges through the image of the other or through what he calls the possessible, since this would be, according to him, merely an empirical question of observation. However, it seems to me an important question, not only at the empirical level, but also at the theoretical. But before we delve into this, a few words about the position of Hegel in Lacan's teaching. I tell you no news when I say that Lacan received his knowledge of Hegel mainly via Alexandre Kojève and his reading of the phenomenology of spirit. As far as I can see, there's no explicit reference to the elements of the philosophy of right in Lacan's work, but there are references to Hegel's reflections on the police in his late seminars. And this suggests that he also read the elements, since it's the locus classicus, basically Hegel's most important text on the subject of the police. In the Écrit, however, all direct references to Hegel refer to the phenomenology of spirit. Most of the time, when Lacan refers to Hegel, it's to the chapter on the master and the slave in the phenomenology of spirit that Kojève also focused on. Hegel is the main authority for Lacan's central assumption that man's desire is the desire of the other. In the presentation on psychical causality that is part of the Écrit, Lacan writes, man's very desire is constituted, Hegel tells us, under the sign of mediation. It is the desire to have one's desire recognized. We find this anew in the whole development of his satisfaction, beginning with the conflict between master and slave through the entire dialectic of labor. That's what Lacan writes. In his outline of a phenomenology of right, Kojève, in turn, signals that the first possession precedes the intersubjective struggle for recognition, but that only the confrontation with the desire of the other turns it into property and the subject into an owner. And that's also what it comes down to in Lacan. In other words, when we talk about properties, we do not merely talk about objects that satisfy needs. We talk about objects of desire, insofar as desire is formed by human intersubjectivity and the attendant symbolism. Property thus belongs to the order of the symbolic and immediately to the realm of the imaginary, but not to the real. As Jean Schröder writes, according to Lacanian psychoanalysis, subjectivity is intersubjectivity mediated through objectivity, just as in Hegelian philosophy. And Lacan also sees Marx in that Hegelian tradition. Thus, in the sixth seminar, he ridicules a Marxist with whom he had a conversation on the topic. Because this Marxist insisted that language was an instrument of communication between humans whose subjectivity was supposed to be a natural given. And that by not referring things to this foundation of interhuman relations, one would come to fetishize language. And Lacan comments on this with the words, undoubtedly, I'm prepared to admit that in effect we must encounter something that is very like a fetish. But I ask myself whether this something which is called a fetish is not precisely one of the very dimensions of the human world, and precisely the one that must be taken into account. If we see the whole thing being rooted in interhuman relations, we end up with only one thing, which is to refer the fact of the fetishization of human objects to some interhuman misunderstanding, which itself therefore supposes a reference back to signification. So his argument is this this way of seeing things turns in circles. He goes on to say, it seems to me that it is enough to open the first volume of Kapital to see that the first step in Marx's analysis is very properly speaking in connection with the fetish character of merchandise to tackle the problem very exactly at the proper level, that is at the level of the signifier. The signifying relationships are given first, basically, before the social relations. So according to Lacan, the fetish character of the commodity is not a mere distortion of human social interaction, but a form of general conundrum that confronts humans insofar as they are subjugated by the symbolic. We leave aside the questions this may raise and come back to the function of Winnicott's first possession in Lacan's theory. How does Lacan go on to combine Hegel and Winnicott? We start with the objet A, since Lacan, in a lecture at the Institut Français of London in 1975, identified the objet A with the transitional object. According to Lacan, the objet A is the elusive object cause of desire. and desires generated when the needs and demands of the infant are caught in the snares of the symbolic and its endless slippage from signifier to signifier. To explain this, we might return to the wooden reel of the Fort Da game that Lacan also equates with the transitional object. In the case of the Fort Da game, the reel starts out as a stand-in for the lost fulfillment that is associated with the mother. But at the same time, it seals her absence, insofar as this absence is necessary for the stand-in to emerge and sustain itself in the differential game of presences and absences. And of course, in this game, the real can then be replaced by another object that seems to fulfill the same symbolic function better, and then another, and then another. That's basically how we can describe the what Winnicott calls the emergence of the cultural field. But what is decisive in this process is not only this potentially endless slippage, but that the subject emerges as a supplement of the elusive object. In the 14th seminar, Lacan says, the Fort Da, insofar as it refers to maternal presence or absence, is not here the exhaustive articulation of the coming into play of the signifier. The signifier does not designate what is not there, it engenders it. What is not there at the origin is the subject itself. Again, I mean, this needs to be explained as a lot of Lacan's articulations. Human desire is the desire of the other, and accordingly, the child slips more or less inevitably from its own desire for the parent to the parent's own desire for an object. The infant tries to become or to acquire the object that the parent desires. And this way, the objet A changes hands, so to speak. This is a crucial point, because that starts the process of the child's subjectivation, of the child turning into a subject that is caught up in and represented by the symbolic. It is a subject insofar as it has subjected itself to the vagaries of the symbolic, first and foremost to the demand to be represented by a signifier, by which the other might formulate a desire. To put it bluntly, the child might come to ask itself whether it is more desirable to the parent while in possession of the real or while not in possession of it. The objet A is thus not only what the subject desires, but also what the big other desires, the supposed matrix of the symbolic system. What the other desires determines the subject's desire, and thus the alienation of this desire in signifiers. As in Winnicott, this desire gives the subject a claim to the specifically human world. It enables the subject, in the words of Lacan, to take possession of what in his world are the very conditions imposed upon him, as if these conditions were made for him. So the objet A, as cause of desire, entangles the child in language. But it is not itself subsumable to language. This is also crucial. It's still associated with the fullness that is left behind when the infant entered into the symbolic. And this is precisely why this object remains the object of desire, because it seems to provide a support that surpasses, one might say, transcends the symbolic. And that is why Lacan says that the subject consists in something that is outside himself, namely the objet A, and therefore keeps trying to establish connection to it. And in this context, Lacan, quoting Simone Weil, refers to the most dense, the most opaque relationship which can be presented to us of man with the object of his desire, namely the relation of the miser with his money box. Obviously, the money box here is an instance of the objet A, but Lacan points out that the attempts to have and to hold this object can be a lot more abstract and seemingly pure. Any kind of intellectual work, for example, can be described as a specific form of trying to lay hold onto an elusive object cause of desire by the means of language. In this context, Lacan refers to the German term for concept, Begriff, which is derived from begreifen, to grasp something. And just as an aside, the etymology of conceptum, which comes from capere, is just the same. It's always about grasping. So almost any specifically human, that is symbolic activity, can be described as an attempt to get hold of an object that stays out of reach in one way or another. So the object relation is to a large extent very flexible, but it's also to some degree fixed. And what generates this fixation is a phantasm. So now we come to the phantasm. What we have so far is an object of desire that supplements the subject, insofar as the latter is alienated from itself and thus split by its representation through signifiers. And Lacan, who likes formulas, as you may know, develops on that basis what he calls the formula of the phantasm. If we have some kind of... Probably seen that as barred as diamond A, small a. The phantasm gives the relation between S, subject, and A, stability, insofar as it links them, binding subject and object in a relation of inclusion and implication that is symbolized by the diamond shape. Lacan compares the effect of this stabilization to the rest of a movie projection, so that all the film's characters' movements freeze in the middle of whatever they're doing and retain the expression they had at this very moment, right? So this phantasm stages a specific interaction between the subject and the object of desire. The represented action can be a sexual act, the primal scene, for example. It can be an act of violence, but it can also be a rather indifferent act. Almost any interaction can conceivably become phantasmatic and thus rigidify desire. Now, this rigidification obviously doesn't arrest desire. Desire keeps moving and slipping, right? Otherwise, the phantasm would make people stop to think and to speak. But the phantasm gives form and direction to the slippage. For example, because it embeds itself in the structure of the subject in such a way that the subject is constantly driven to enact the phantasm. And that is how the phantasm determines the ways in which the subject engages with the world, so that Lacan can designate it as that little piece of imagination by which the subject gains access to reality. An interaction turns into a phantasm when the subject starts to see it as the scene where the subject itself is present as a subject, but in the moment of the disappearance that defines its desire. For example, in the moment of merging with the object of desire by the way of its ultimate attainment, right? Thus, the phantasm does not only link subject and object, but also marks the re-emergence of the gray zone of the first possession, in which they become indistinguishable. In this context, Lacan leaves no doubt that property is always phantasmatic. He refers to the phantasm of the what he calls the major dominant form of every possession, contemplative possession, such, one supposes, as the miser contemplating his money box. And he calls this a mirage of power. And it is a mirage first and foremost because the phantasm veils something, namely the fundamental dispossession that Lacan names symbolic castration, which is just a fancy term for the circumstance that nothing will ever be able to satisfy human desire by definition, as long as the subject remains within the symbolic, because in the symbolic it is always the desire for something other. And what Lacan calls the phallus is not the antidote, but the seal of this symbolic castration. So, and here we come to the notion of the phallus, which is particularly tricky in Lacan, but relevant to the topic, because it marks another step in what you might call the socialization process of appropriation. I already mentioned Jean Schröder and her article Chicks, Nicks, Bundle of Sticks that breaks a lot of ground in the general direction I'm trying to go here. So I'm definitely owe a lot to this text. But Schröder basically identifies the phallus with a socially dominant objet A, and I think that flattens her analysis. The phallus is a signifier, and objet A definitely isn't. It escapes symbolization. However, the phallus is a very special signifier, namely the signifier of the lack that every subject has to face once it is captured in the symbolic. Therefore also the signifier of symbolic castration. It's a bearer of power only insofar as it functions as a necessary symbolic element, namely the entity that consolidates the field of the symbolic by standing in for the circumstance that its entirety is marked by a fundamental lack. And that also means that every subject's desire relates to it in some way or another. And the most basic distinction in this relation is that of aspiring towards having and towards being the phallus, which determines the relation between the sexes. The man is supposed to possess the phallus, while the woman is supposed to lack it, but to be able to take its place. However, the circumstance that the phallus is a signifier of lack, strange conglomeration of presence and absence, complicates this distinction. You know, the phallus is not a positive thing. You know, it would take too much time to go through all the intricacies of the Lacanian conception of the castration complex. And I'm not even sure I can follow every term. But what it comes down to is that the relation of the phallus is paradoxical for both sexes. As Lacan himself expresses it in the 5th seminar, the woman must be the phallus against the background of not being it, and the man has the phallus against the background of the fact that he does not have it. It's the relation between the sexes that's supposed to resolve this impasse by the symbolic acknowledgement of the being and having that can be granted or denied by the other sex. So, you know, the man has the phallus if the woman acknowledges him having the phallus, and vice versa. And in this precarious symbolic complementarity that grants having to the man and being to the woman, the comedy of the sexes unfolds more or less happily. Now, how does this rather intricate pattern around the having of the phallus relate to the having of the transitional object? It's a bit of a shady move, but I think it might be useful to bring in the term propriation here, that Derrida introduces in Spurs, also in connection with sexuation. According to Derrida, basically in a reading of Nietzsche, sexuation is associated with a process of propriation in which the female sex is defined as inherently giving and the male as inherently taking, but in which this ascription is plagued by a reversal by which the giving actually becomes a taking. By giving herself, doesn't the woman actually receive more than she gives? In the words of Derrida, an undecidable exchange of more into less is unfolding. And Derrida associates this reversibility with the term exappropriation, designating an appropriation that is at the same time an expropriation, depending on the point of view, depending on the angle, so to speak. As often in Derrida, this sounds cool, but it's not very clear what to do with it. But in this context, it might help to clarify what Lacan is doing in the next step of his argument, that I'm sort of collating from bits and pieces. Somewhat surprisingly, Lacan in this context refers to the elementary structures of kinship as developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss as basically a fundamental social structure that both determines the relation between the sexes and property relations. Lacan emphasizes that the unconscious elementary structures of kinship are also elementary structures of property, insofar as they determine givers and receivers by marriage rules that are usually conceived as rules for the exchange of women and goods among different lineages of a tribal society. So a woman enters a society, you might say, as a phallic commodity that is bound to be exchanged between one lineage and another. However, Lacan goes on to say that it's possible to reverse this perspective. He says in the 14th seminar, the exchange of women, I'm not in the process of telling you that it is easily retranslated. Man, as a penile value, circulates very well, but it is clandestine. So a basic reversibility is at work here that might be ascribed to the fact that the phallus can take a positive and a negative value, that it can be ascribed as a plus and a minus sign, so to speak. Interestingly, Claude Lévi-Strauss in an interview also stated that the kinship relations he investigated could just as well be described as an exchange of males among females, and that he just followed conventions by formulating them the other way around. Again, it's a question of, the angle. So it is apparently these symbolic conventions that prevent sexual reversibility from turning into equivalence. For example, in our society, that it's usually the woman who gets a new family name when she marries, while the man retains his own name, right? But overall, the phallic interchanges are supposed to give both parties access to what Lacan calls phallic enjoyment, jouissance, a legitimate enjoyment within the limits that the symbolic order imposes on it. What is striking about the terms jouissance and enjoyment, as Lacan doesn't fail to point out, is that they are also legal property terms, right? All designating the holding or taking of possession. This is consistent with the commonplace that describes the sexual act as an act of reciprocal possession, right? However, Proust speaks of the act of physical possession in which the possessor possesses nothing. Ou d'ailleurs, l'on ne possède rien. And Lacan agrees that in copulation, the subject cannot really possess the body that it embraces. There's a split between possession and jouissance. And this split is also expressed in the legal term, insofar as the one who is ascribed the jouissance of a piece of property is not necessarily the one who owns it, right? Lacan sees this as a demonstration of the way the object is held hostage by desire, insofar as it is the desire of the other. It seems that jouissance can only be experienced in one's own body, but actually jouissance is localized outside, in the realm of exchange, the man enjoying the supposed elusive enjoyment of the woman, and vice versa. Even when the phallus determines its paths, jouissance tends to slide into elusiveness, even in the case of the Hegelian master, as Lacan points out. However much of a master I am, he says, my jouissance is already displaced. To a certain degree, the displacement is an integral part of the enjoyment. In the 14th seminar, Lacan goes on to point out that the legal term of jouissance also implies that I'm able to give it up. The sign of possession is to be able to resign it. Lacan, in this context, points particularly to obsessional relationships, where, as he says, the love which one feels and of which one is the object can only be signified to the subject in terms of possession, which can go so far as the destruction of the object. We already have encountered this jus abutendi as the ultimate proof of ownership in Hegel and in Winnicott. The nagging awareness of the elusive, inherently phantasmatic character of ownership can apparently only be overcome by wasting or rejecting the owned object. But this liminal form of enjoyment is obviously elusive too, since it involves the object's ultimate loss. The more constructive way out of the aporetic property claims involved in sexual relations in particular, and social relations in general, is the formation of larger symbolic units. First and foremost, the family and the institution of marriage as its foundation. Here Hegel comes in again, who doesn't see marriage as a contract between pre-existent subjects, but as the constitution of a unit whose members ultimately attain the status of subjects by their connection. Together with their ancestry and progeny, they form what Hegel calls a universal and enduring person. which has external reality and property. You know, I already quoted this. In a family property that unites the spiritual and the material by being both palpable and potentially unlimited in time, potentially eternal. Lacan ultimately also posits subjects that need to accept the role ascribed to them in more encompassing symbolic units by transcendental powers of appropriation. Hegel's ideas here also seem to have left unacknowledged traces in Lacan's theories and given it additional coherence. And perhaps these unacknowledged traces also allow us to take a better look at phantasmatic property relation in even larger social units as the state and society, about which the thoughts of Lacan tended to be a bit spotty. It will take about 5 more minutes. And it's relatively accessible, so I hope you still have room for this. Okay, in this context, Gabriel Tarde and his remarkable essay Monadology and Sociology might be useful, since it tries to describe society as a whole as each individual's reciprocal possession in many highly varied forms of every other. This is a striking proposal, since we tend to associate one person's possession of another with slavery or some other form of bondage. However, the venerable historian of slavery, Orlando Patterson, has pointed out that slavery is just one form of ownership in another person, and that this ownership is thus not the decisive criterion of slavery. In everyday parlance, we see nothing odd in terms such as my wife, my husband, my parents, my children, my friend, my boss, my president, and so on, as sketching a framework of mutual obligations, right? Perhaps the claims of mutual ownership that articulate themselves in such formulations should be taken more seriously than is usually done. Tarde writes that unilateral possession, such as that in ancient law of the slave by the master, of the son by the father, or by the wife by the husband, is only a first step towards the social link. Thanks to the development of civilization, the possessed becomes more and more a possessor, and the possessor a possessed, until by equality of right, by popular sovereignty, and by the equitable exchange of services, ancient slavery, now mutualized and universalized, makes each citizen at once the master and the servant of every other. In this context, we can also think of verbs like to belong that express a similar reciprocity, which even extends to non-human entities. An object may belong to you, but you may also belong to an object, for example, to a specific piece of land, the place where you belong. Power relations in the state and in society likewise tend to be expressed by more or less reciprocal property claims. It has been pointed out repeatedly that legal terms of property claims and of political sovereignty derive from the same term, namely dominium. Often this connection is given a religious underpinning by the assumption that God or the gods are the absolute owners of creation, and that the unequal distribution of power and property is due to a divine allotment that includes rules of ritual and sacrifice. In the process of secularization, this role of sovereign distributor is taken over by abstract notions of community. For example, Kant's notion of mankind as the rightful sovereign owner of the whole earth in the metaphysics of morals. But this in itself changes less than one would think in the scheme of things. What seems more relevant to the topic is another remark by Gabriel Tarde, namely that unilateral possession and reciprocal possession are necessarily united. In other words, what we possess necessarily also possesses us, and this includes the world of non-human beings. It's easy to see that the range of their properties, in the broadest sense, largely determines the day-to-day actions and behaviors of all members of society. these properties constitute an order to which everyone has to subject and accommodate oneself. And that would include even the complete destruction of property in some form of potlatch. In this context, it's significant that some languages, for example, Biblical Hebrew, designate a person's property and a person's prescribed destiny with the same word. This inexorable determination by property is particularly easy to see in the case of one's ownership in one's own body. If that body is in pain or in other kinds of distress and urgent need, this distress can absorb me to the point of depersonalization. And this reversibility provides all forms of property with an inherent uncanniness, of which the fear and ambivalent desire of spirit possession is perhaps the most poignant expression. In treatises on spirit possession, for example in passages of On the Mystery, De Mysteriis, by the Neoplatonist Iamblichus, it is affirmed that spirit possession not only involves becoming wholly the God's property, but also of sharing God's power and exercising activity in common with him. Lacan points out the same reversibility, referring to an article by his ethnographer friend Michel Leris on possession rituals in an Ethiopian town. One might add that the same dynamic is at work in the representation of hauntings in all walks of culture. Haunted houses and other uncanny objects tend to raise property claims on their owners, perhaps including persistent claims of former owners. In Lacan's reading, Poe's Purloined Letter, a short story, The Purloined Letter, from that story, the letter is such an uncanny object. And in his article on the topic, Lacan uses the phrase tomber en possession de la lettre, coming into the letter's possession, and calls it an admirably ambiguous bit of language, because as the Queen, the minister, and Dupin, the detective, possess the letter, its undisclosed content comes to possess and circumscribe them. And that is the way in which Lacan generally describes the working of the symbolic in the unconscious, a possession by unacknowledged signifiers. The problem I have with this can perhaps also be ascribed to its insistence on the very Hegelian assumption that any resistance to the symbolic is futile. The truth toward which the analyst is supposed to lead the analysand is a message written in the analysand's unconscious. In the second seminar, Lacan calls this truth the analysand's lot, the fortune allotted to him in his particular destiny, as he says, and to which he has to subject himself in one way or another. And my impression is that here Lacan propagates a very sophisticated form of what Walter Benjamin calls Schicksalsverfallenheit, of a mythically inclined submission to the powers of fate and their sacrificial demands. The obvious alternative to such a Schicksalsverfallenheit is the one delineated by Lacan's pupil, Guattari, together with Gilles Deleuze, to drift toward the schizo or nomad nomos that engages with the world as with an open space, that is, as they emphasize, without property, without property enclosure or measurement. The problem is that this drift has to abandon the subject form and is therefore very hard to sustain in a society that constantly makes demands of identification on everyone. I have to end here, and I can't end with a very strong recommendation what to do with all this. I just think that there's a good case to be made that the phantasm-generating parallel process of subjectivation and appropriation that has been delineated by Hegel and further elaborated by Lacan and others hasn't altogether been given the attention it deserves. Lacan once asserted that the true formula of atheism is not God doesn't exist, but God is unconscious. His point is that it's largely indifferent whether God exists or not, because he doesn't need to exist in order to have effects. And that he will have effects as long as the signifier God does exist and is at work in the unconscious. Analogously, one might say that the true formula of anarchism might not be property is theft, but property is unconscious. That post-Hegelian intuition certainly doesn't make things any easier for the anarchists, but it might open a few new perspectives on culture and society. And that's what I have to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for that rich reading of Hegel and Lacan and Winnicott, and for making such an important contribution to our seminar. And I think maybe I'll pick up, I'm going to pick up on the last words, which is about anarchism maybe being, property is the unconscious, property is unconscious. Property is unconscious rather than property is theft, right? Okay. But first, I take it that the key argument that you made and the key contribution here is that there is a family resemblance in a kind of Wittgensteinian way between Hegel's notion of property as being constitutive of personhood and Lacan/Winnicott's work on transitional objects and their relationship to desire and objet petita, and so I take it this is a kind of a family resemblance, and the idea then would be that the possession, and here we need to be careful about the words, and you've been very careful about the words, so I'm going to try and be careful also, but that the possession of the object, because it's hard to, it's the child's possession of the transitional object, for instance, at least its possession and play with the transitional object, is linked to the formation of the self for the child. So in a way, in Foucauldian terms, is important for forms of assujettissement, right? Okay. And that, I take it, is a kind of a descriptive claim. And I take it at the end when you said, what do we make of this? Not sure yet. That's because your intervention is predominantly at the level of the descriptive claim as to Hegel and as to Lacan and Winnicott, right? And I think you're careful not to go any further and to embrace any of this at a normative level, I think. I mean, at least in your paper. I don't know where the book will go. But for the time being, in the paper, you're not suggesting that this is, you're not suggesting that this is correct, actually. I mean, it's a correct interpretation. It's a correct interpretation of Hegel and Lacan, but I take it you're not making the further claim that it's actually correct that the transitional object plays an important role in the personhood formation or subject creation. Maybe you believe so, but I mean, you haven't made that claim. You haven't made that argument now. So it's but further, you're not making any claim that we should, in some sense, embrace any of this at a normative level, even if it were correct. Okay. But I do want to push us then to the normative level, because I want to propose an alternative reading I did my homework. So I read all of the, I read it all. I want to propose an alternative reading based on the Winnicott, really, which I found very productive. In part because I wouldn't want to embrace the idea that property rights, or that conceptions of property, legal conceptions of property, particularly property rights, particularly private property rights, would be necessary to the stage of full human development, regardless of whether or not you're in favor of private property. So this is not an argument that we need to get rid of private property. It's just an argument that I would want to resist the claim somehow that some notion of legal property rights, right? So some notion of property from a legal perspective being and involving exclusive ownership. So some notion of private property would somehow be necessary to human development at a developed stage. Mm-hmm. And so to make this argument, I think I would want to focus on what Winnicott talks about illusions and disillusionment. Mm-hmm. And so this is on page 240 of the Winnicott paper on transitional objects. And it's where he's actually giving this schema, of the mother and the infant being mediated by illusions, being mediated by the transitional object. Mm-hmm. And it seems that what he's suggesting is that, or what he says is that the mother's main task, these are his words, next to providing opportunity for illusion, is disillusionment. Mm-hmm. This is primary to the task of weaning, and it also continues as one of the tasks of parents and educators. So his discussion of weaning from the mother and weaning from transitional objects, so weaning from dependence on others and on objects is the primary is the mother's main task, quote unquote, but is the psychological imperative or the healthy development. Mm-hmm. The healthy development is described here, and this is this is all about child development in this field of psychiatry. We're talking about child development, right? And the idea is that healthy child development is one in which the relationship of the infant to the mother, the child to the parent, is one of weaning that happens through, according to Winnicott, the transitional object, right? But there's also, I take it then, a weaning of the transitional object as well, so that the notion of the child development at play here is one in which, through disillusionment, through something that we call maturity, right, the child becomes in a way independent, not dependent on the mother, not dependent on the father, and no longer dependent on transitional objects. Ultimately, the transitional objects, the teddies and the babies and whatnot, ultimately we want the adult, we think of the mature adult as not depending on those objects anymore. Failure, in some sense, failed development is dependence on one of those objects. successful development or healthy development of the human is no longer dependence on possession or property. I think that the goal of disillusionment is to get rid of that way in which property is necessary for one's self-conception. Now, on this reading, and it's interesting because you started by talking about this. It's the relationship between the elements of a philosophy of right and the phenomenology of spirit, right? It's this chronology of emerging self-consciousness towards absolute spirit in one, towards maybe the state in the other, but in both cases, there's a sense in which the early stages are overcome, right? So the early stages, I mean, that's true. It's true in the logic as well. The early stages of sense certainty is overcome by perception, is overcome, etc. The early stages of consciousness, and in fact, the Lord-bondsman relationship is a way to overcome certain stages. In a developmental reading of Hegel, one could wonder if the elements of a philosophy of right is also that stages that are being overcome, such that contract, in a way, is more important than mere property, because it creates the interpersonal relationship of recognition, etc. And that we're building towards civil society and the family, and civil society and corporations building towards the state. That in some way, it turns out that maybe on one reading, property is it's kind of a basic, and maybe not then foundational, but kind of like a basic first step that in some way we overcome. And that would be the idea of weaning ourselves from it, so that ultimately it's not that it's foundational, but that it's something that we need to overcome. That the possession, the transitional object, is something that is for the child at a very young age. And part of our entire effort and the mother's main task is to get rid of this dependence on the object. Couldn't it then be, right, that at a normative level, that being mature adults in society means having overcome our dependence on possession qua property? And here there's a big problem about possession versus property still. I don't know how to get over it, but definitely maybe having overcome dependence on the need. Well, let's put it this way. Yeah. Having overcome our dependence in order to be fully functional adults in a collective, on the need for property, even if the legal rules about property go on in a way. So this doesn't necessarily mean that we might then want to abolish private property, or might not. But we've gotten to a stage where what this is suggesting, what the psychological, developmental, the child development psychology that's represented by Winnicott and that's picked up by Lacan. And I have to say, I think I would put aside all of the phallus stuff, simply because I don't think it's aged well. And I think even if we're talking about a symbolic, I feel it just doesn't age well. In today's day and age, I don't know, I would have a really hard time talking about the phallus instead of the clitoris, or I don't know, like what word I would use, but I'd have to ditch the word phallus. Maybe use some other word. Putting that aside, I would say, what do you think of that reading or use of Winnicott then? Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot in there, so I will slowly circle in here.
Yeah.
I mean, concerning the problem, of the normativity. I mean, I'm in the sort of happy position that I'm not a philosopher but a literary scholar, so I can be, sort of a happy pragmatist there. I mean, I use these conceptions in order to read texts, right? And I mean, that's also I'm very unfaithful there. The first book was very much Walter Benjamin and Lacan, and the second book was very much Bloomberg and Deleuze, and this book, I mean, returning to Lacan, but I mean, underlying.
This book will be Lacan and.
I mean, it's complicated. Let's not go there. But I mean, concerning if I would have to make a statement about the ethics that I could subscribe to, it would basically be what I mentioned at the end, the Deleuze-Guattarian ethics that underlies, Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateaus, because they basically says, okay, the essential level is basically not the level that we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is what they would call strata, and they're interested in the destratified stuff that goes on. When these hard and fast conceptions are not at work. Again, the diverse machines, assemblages that are going on all the time, and that basically make our happiness to a much higher degree than we acknowledge. Again, the problem is that when the chips are down, these destratified structures are or processes are extremely volatile. So it's not a good idea to build your life on this. So I think you need something else, and to some degree, the Deleuzians are living proof of this. So I think pointing to Deleuze and Guattari is necessary but not sufficient. So the question of ethics, it doesn't solve the question of ethics that you touched upon. Still, I don't think that I would follow you on your path of basically emancipation from the object. And I think it's also a misreading of Winnicott, because of psychoanalysis in general. In psychoanalysis, you never emancipate yourself from the object unless you go autistic or something like that. I mean, the ideal way for that Winnicott delineates is basically let's say a dynamization of. He says dissolution of the object, not in the sense that it disappears, but that it spreads over the social field. And that means that it basically moves from object to object. That's what Lacan calls desire. First you are into, the teddy, then you're into, later on you're into dinosaurs, and then you're into Harry Potter, and then you're really, really into the girl in the other class, and then basically your object choice is caught up by, for example, the heterosexual matrix. That doesn't mean that that the object had disappeared, but that it has matured. For example, by what he calls symbolic castration. Right? We could talk a long time about the phallus, and I agree that it's a problematic term, and it would perhaps be a good idea to replace it. He also uses. One can always use the letter phi with if the term phallus shocks is considered shocking. But I think still it's a constitutive element of this, precisely because of this reversibility that I insisted so much on. In a way, that's also why I talked about the comedy of the sexes. But that doesn't solve the sort of ethical impetus that underlies what you're saying. The offer I make there is that of Tart, that we basically, again, take instead of basically assuming we have to overcome basically tendencies of appropriation to arrive at maturity of selflessness or ability to sacrifice for others. We basically see society as basically an enormously complex network of mutual property claims. That's how far that carries is another question. I'm not sure, but I think it would be worth the sweat of the noble soul to delve deeper into this. It's very sketchy and in Tart. I definitely don't think that Hegel has much to offer on that level, precisely because of the paradoxes that evolve in this chapter on the elements, but that he keeps down basically by normative suggestions. But for example, about slavery, the inability of owning a person becomes paradoxically a legitimation of slavery. I think that's a famous point to make. And this, that also touches on the problem of self-possession that I think is pops up in his text, but is not handled sufficiently or in a satisfying way. We could come back to the question of the relation between the sexes and in the family, where we have the usual sort of sexist salto mortale that Hegel assumes that the relation between the sexes in the family must be maintained. Otherwise, things become dishy and the whole structure becomes unstable, right? And as often, this argument is basically we can't assume that we have to assume a passive role for the woman because the whole thing would basically not work if we assumed that basically there was this basic reversibility. So basically, both man and woman are called to play the role that is basically destined for them. And it's easy to see that this is not based on, you know, any particular experience with men and women, but on the normative demands of the system. Mm-hmm. And I think it's precisely, you know, in a way, the introduction of the term of the phallus and the reversibility that goes with it that introduces more leeway here. I mean, that would be another point of discussion. And again, I'm not totally sure I'm right here, but that would be the hill I would start out with defending it. Perhaps not the hill I would be prepared to die on.
Okay, good. I'm going to open it up to questions so start thinking about formulating that question you have in your head. Before I do so, I mean, your response makes me think that somehow we would really need to do a lot of work here to distinguish distinguish layers here, right? Object, possession, possession with a certain kind of claim to exclusiveness, mine, right? Property, some notion of property, and then legal notions of property. And I know that you were being careful in your presentation, but I take it any work that we would do here to get anywhere normatively, it would really require a tremendous amount of care to distinguish between just object, as in transitional object, and some conception of possession, and then some conception of ownership, right? And I just feel, I mean, my instinct is that all of the weight, all of the normative weight would have to be in drawing those distinctions and being careful about them. Yeah.
I mean, of course, I absolutely agree, but I mean, the point I was making is that there's also some kind of underlying continuity, right? That basically, to some degree, these legal terms blend into these psychoanalytic terms, and in a way, Lacan develops them often, relying on the strength of the legal terms. You know, I mean, if I talk about the jus abutendi of the infant, of course that's a little joke, but still, I mean, there is it's not a sort of illegitimate transfer. I think there is a continuity between them, and that is partly the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. Although, when you said it's not illegitimate, it's so much of the legitimacy has to be on the table. Otherwise, it's just slippages, right? In other words, if Lacan is using legal property notions, right? That needs to be really examined, defended. If there's slippage, right, there can't be slippage right there. It has to be kind of, we have to keep our spotlight on exactly that place where there's a slippage, it seems to me.
I hear you. Again, I mean, I would say Lacan, of course, would
would be very happy to point out that slippage is the basis of everything. I mean, in a way, that's the point, that whatever we're saying, whatever we're talking, that there's the slippage of the signified under the signifier. So, and we always say more or less than we want to say. We never arrive. I mean, we never arrive at the object art. That also means we never say what we really want to say, right? We always miss what we want to say, and so there's this. We're in the dumps anyway. So, as careful as we are, I'm not sure what follows from that, right? Because obviously we can still do, meticulous conceptual work that is very worthwhile, and that is sometimes necessary to avoid certain slippery slopes, for example, political ones that we definitely don't want, right? But then perhaps Lacan is not the best authority. It's not the most helpful person to go to.
Okay, I saw some hands. Did I see some hands? Yes? En français ou en anglais? Okay.
I'm interested in the relationship of the subject and property, more on the side of the subject.
Sorry, could you speak up a little?
So I'm interested in the relationship
Yeah.
of the subject and property, with a particular focus on the subject, Lacan. And I'm wondering, when I think about the Hegelian conception, especially in relation to texts, it's a conception where the subject somewhat realizes itself. I think something seems to work out. By making a claim, a property claim, the subject seems to realize something that was not realized before. In Lacan, I feel like the property claim still holds at its core the subject that is failing. It is failing to grasp these accessible notions of the objectivity are the real, the unconscious. And I'm wondering how these two ideas, these two concepts can be reconciliated. This is really what I'm struggling with.
I tried this a little bit, but of course in a way that makes Lacan the winner, right? Basically saying that Hegel achieves the stability of property and the conceptions basically by merging descriptive and prescriptive statements in an illegitimate way, right? And I mean, it's obvious that when you read particularly this particular Hegel, late Hegel, that his interest is always to, I mean, that's actually sentence of the element to demonstrate that what is real is rational and what is rational is real, right? And so he basically eternalizes, for example, hierarchies between the sexes in a way that is offensive to us. Again, basically, what I would offer is a kind of more flexible stabilizer in the form of Gabriel Tarde. Whether that holds up again is the question, because and I would also need to delve deeper into the Gabriel Tarde reception. That's basically a text that has basically come up over the last 2 weeks or so. That is, as basically one of the solution to one of my troubles, right?
It's come up in your work in the last 2 weeks.
I mean,
it's new.
I stumbled upon this text basically. I mean, sometimes again with Deleuze and Guattari mention him on, although another book that's much less helpful for this context, I think. But I mean, I never really sat down and read it. when I read it, I found it enormously useful. It filled exactly that little gap that I was struggling with there. Right? Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm interested in Tart because it seems, if I understood it correctly, he's veering Lacanian psychoanalysis towards a more object relations type of examination. And so I was wondering if you could maybe clarify the sort of differences between this sort of way of bringing Lacanian thought forward and its sort of inherent opposition with object relations theory, which I imagine would be on the subject of speech, and on speech. I was also further wondering, to me it would seem that there would be an essential distrust of law in. I'm not sure if Lacan ever mentions this, but the entire legal project, because of its inability to fully grasp a meaning or a truth to possession. And I was wondering if this is ever made explicit in Lacan, if this is something he discusses in his work.
I'm still looking, basically. I mean, and again, these are bits and pieces that I sort of collated from, diverse seminars. So far, I haven't found anything, but I'm not sure there's nothing there. So at the moment, I draw a blank. To your second question, coming to the first, this is a very interesting one. I mean, to avoid misunderstandings, Tart was not reacting to Lacan or Freud. Tart wrote around 1900, and he's much more in the this article is monadology and sociology is so interesting because he makes a move that later on became that rather recently has become quite fashionable, namely to basically I mean, in some respect, it resembles what's called OOO, the object-oriented ontology, right? Basically trying to give the object a new sort of elevated status in philosophy. I mean, a little bit more obvious family resemblance is in again Deleuze and Guattari. What Tart does is, in a way, to extend sociological concepts toward organic matter and even inorganic matter. That's where the monadology comes in. Basically, that reality consists of monads, right? A society of monads, right? And that you can basically even atoms have what you might call a social life, right? Which is much more. I mean, Whitehead would be another philosopher who is in the same tradition, right? That is basically what the object relation that is sketched in Tart, which is very different from the psychoanalytical relation, but I think still compatible with it. I mean, the Anti-Oedipus is always read as this sort of critique of Freudian psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis. But to some degree, it's also an expansion and reworking of Lacanian psychoanalysis. In a way, despite the adolescent tone in which it's written, and sometimes, very aggressive tone in which it is written, Guattari still saw himself as in the Lacanian tradition, and basically was sort of shocked that basically Lacan kicked him out after the publication of Anti-Oedipus. And actually, he still did do psychoanalytic sessions in his clinic in Laborde, right? Perhaps slightly unconventional, but he definitely this rejection of psychoanalysis in the Anti-Oedipus still comes from a psychoanalytic perspective. And I mean, Deleuze was to some degree, before Anti-Oedipus, was you might almost say, orthodox Lacanian. The second half of the logic of sense is Lacanian through and through, right? So I would tend to, again, see continuities here rather than sharp divisions between the parties.
Eva, last question.
Can I make it in French?
Ouais, vas-y.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
J'espère.
Okay, no, I try in English.
No, no.
No,
No, yes, I can try.
Okay.
There's a thing that I don't really understand in the end, if I say correctly. Like one of the claims, like at the end, was to say that there's like a neutral property claim. Is it or not? Like at the
Yeah,
end,
yeah,
it
yeah.
was like saying, okay, so, and I think it's like because I find it really bon, français. Je trouve que c'était très rafraîchissant d'un point de vue critique d'avoir ce décalage-là par rapport à la propriété. Mais je comprends pas. Enfin, j'ai du mal à comprendre comment est-ce qu'à la fin le claim c'est de dire que la propriété c'est neutre, parce que j'ai l'impression que dans tout l'exposé, en fait, ce qui a été fait, c'est de dire en fait, ça peut être du positif, ça peut être du négatif. Celui qui possède peut être celui qui dépossède. Celui qui, enfin, il y a vraiment du mouvement partout, dans toutes les strates, que ce soit à l'enfance comme à l'âge adulte finalement, parce que c'est pas juste à l'enfance. Et vraiment, cette dimension un peu phénoménologique de la propriété. Et je trouve ça étrange, en fait, à la fin, de se dire que ce qui en ressort, plutôt que du désir justement et plutôt que de reprendre quelque chose qui soit plus en termes de moi l'idée du fantasme, je trouvais qu'elle était plus pertinente justement pour cette dualité entre du plus et du moins, et j'ai trouvé ça étrange en fait de formuler la neutralité après tout en développement où moi j'ai pas du tout senti de la neutralité en tout cas, et peut-être j'aurais plus, j'ai l'impression en fait que d'un point de vue théorique et critique, le fait de dire la propriété is unconscious, like true anarchy, propriety is unconscious. Déjà moi je pense que j'aurais formulé différemment. Je trouve que c'est hyper rafraîchissant et j'aime beaucoup l'idée, mais j'aurais dit more like propriety can be unconscious. Like it's not supposed to be, but we've seen that it can be or it can not be. Like I think that's what I get from your presentation. And so I would more like, j'aurais plus envisagé le geste de dire que la propriété can be unconscious, plus comme si on rejoint au strat à Deleuze et tout ça, plus l'envisager comme une ligne de fuite. Il en parle beaucoup dans Qu'est-ce que la philosophie, et du coup c'est vraiment quelque chose qui peut être hyper dangereux en fait, de dire que la propriété est unconscious, parce que de fait si on regarde le social field, propriety, like it's really violent, but at the same time, like for the person, like pour la femme who heard about phallus, I mean I don't care, je m'en fiche si des hommes parlent de phallus, honnêtement, et du coup it's a way also of making it like dangerous, and at the same time like
It'll make what dangerous? I'm not following you.
Like the take of saying that propriety is and like propriety is unconscious, like it's dangerous in a way of the implications that and I think that's what you were trying to why you rejected a bit the claim of saying that propriety can be unconscious is because it can be dangerous from a social point of view. Like what about the structure of propriety? Like what about what propriety makes, how it structures, comment la propriété a formé et forme aujourd'hui la société. Enfin, d'un point de vue objectif, qu'est-ce qui se passe derrière la propriété? So it's like at the same time, I think it can be dangerous in that way, but also really refreshing. Je sais pas si.
Okay. Bien. Bien.
Sorry for the bit long.
Not at all. Not at all.
I mean, I try to. I mean, there's a lot there, you know, and I mean, I answer in English because otherwise my brain will go kaput, right? So I mean, when you say neutrality, I mean, in a way, the point is that even though you know, I think I see what you mean. I mean, it's never neutral because it's always phantasmatic, you know. It's always invested with desire, right? We can't get out of this, right? That's precisely, basically, what I'm going against, right? There's no basically neutral property term, right? That also means it's always political, like it's always, invested with questions of gender and what have you. But I think what you mean by neutrality is also what I mentioned with reversibility. Basically the fact that the phallus can become neutral or it can be positive or negative, right? Not neutral, but positive or negative. It can basically the situation can sort of slip again from one point of view to the other, right? And again, the question is, who's to be master? Also between the sexes, right? But I mean, this is not sort of the that doesn't get us out of the question of the hierarchy, of course. And I sort of the problematic of social hierarchy is based on property relations and all of this. I mean, again, I would return to this quote by Tarde that I think is quite decisive here, namely that there's never mutual possession without unilateral possession, right? And this is in a way not I would always at this point I can only defend it as a sort of empirical statement, right? There's always this two dimensions. There's this reversibility, but perhaps there's someone who grants this reversibility,
That's why it's difficult for me to think about reversibility in a neutral way. I see what you mean, and I understand you, and I think that's a descriptive point. But I think for me it feels like pas efficace, like a concept that is not efficace d'un point de vue des effets que ça va avoir. It's just like my opinion. It's not
efficacious for what?
For critique and for like what people are gonna read this, but we don't think that way. But maybe like just okay, what's the effect if people see and feel propriety as neutral? Like, this is what I think when I heard about
Okay, again, this is a complex question. I mean, perhaps coming back to what you said during the first part of this conversation about about the problem you have with the notion that property is unconscious, right? What I mean by that is that we can't get rid of it, right? I think a lot of, and since you mentioned critique, I mean, that would be my critique of a lot of critique. That they, for example, assume that there's a lot of, basically a pre-established harmony. You know, let's get rid of capitalism, right? And then everything will be hunky-dory. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Russian Revolution and all that, but hasn't worked out that ideally, you know. I mean, there have been functioning anarchistic structures, you know, Paris Commune, Catalonia, what have you, you know. But basically, it's, you know, it lasted for 2 months. Then some big man come and basically killed everyone in sight, right? There's a problem there, right? There's no pre-established harmony that establishes itself once we get rid of the distortion of, I don't know, capitalism or sexism or racism, is one of these, is to be considered here. Again, this is, you know, what way do I have to tell, I mean, can I tell you how to get out of this? No. I'm just saying things are more complicated. We have to sit down and figure this out, right? And I mean, for the meantime, another thing that I could say in this, when we're talking about, for example, the relation between the sexes and the sort of constant tension between hierarchy and reversibility, right? I'm thinking of something that, you know, this British Lacanian psychoanalyst Darian Leader said that, and he also referred to this term that I think Lacan coined of the comedy of the sexes, right? Why not take this whole thing with a bit more of humor, you know? But I mean, that's also not a solution, you know. I'm just here to make trouble. I'm not here to give you solutions. Sorry.
All right. Well, so maybe we'll stop there and invite anybody who wants to continue the conversation to have a drink and continue the conversation at the pub. Okay. And for the time being, thank Björn Quiring for his marvelous presentation and for engaging us all in this conversation.
Well, thank you all. It was an absolute pleasure.
Good. And so, in terms of our planning, so we have two more sessions. But so the session on Friday is not going to happen here. We have a 2-day colloque at the Sorbonne. So you can sign up for that and come to any part of that you'd like. There's a way to sign up to register. It's going to be at the Sorbonne one day and at the Panthéon Sorbonne the other day, Friday and Saturday, full days. And then our last session won't be here either. It will be at the Columbia Global Paris Center at 4 Rue de Chevreuse, and Etienne Balibar will be intervening. Okay? So those will be our last 2 sessions, okay? And I don't know how I'll do the notebook, but I'll have it out for the Balibar, and you can sign retroactively if you came or whatever. We'll figure something out, okay? Question?
Yeah,
Yes.
will you send us the RSVP link to the conference of the Sorbonne?
Yes.
I think it's not yet online on the University website, right? Or maybe I'm wrong.
I sent out I think it's on the poster. There's a QR code. I'll send it out again.
Also for the Sorbonne one?
I thought I put the QR code. I thought there was a QR code for the Sorbonne one, and it's an affiche. But I'll send it again. I'll send it around again. Okay. And I think I also I'll send around the online thing and the affiche. Okay. So you can sign up. Yeah, because you have to get into the Sorbonne, you'll have to be on the list. All right? Okay? Thank you very much. And anybody who wants to join us for a drink, please do. Thank you, Bjorn. Let me just close up here. Oh, I see.